Welcome back to Eschatology Matters. I'm Josh Howard, and I'm joined today by Dr. Ben Merkle. So, Dr. Merkle, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Dr. Merkle, if you're not familiar with him, is the president at New St. Andrews College, as well as being a senior fellow of theology and humanities. Dr. Merkle holds a D.Phil in Oriental Studies from Oxford University, serves as a teaching elder at Christ Church in Moscow, Idaho, and has also written a few books. And the two that I had listed were The White Horse King, which was Thomas Nelson, and Defending the Trinity, which was through Oxford University Press. Is that correct?
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Well, Dr. Merkle, give us a little bit of an introduction, if you don't mind. I would suspect many who tune into this channel might be familiar with New St. Andrews, but what's kind of the impetus behind forming New St. Andrews? It's a not new school, but a newer school, and how did you play a role in that? What was the impetus behind the formation for New St. Andrews specifically?
Yeah, so NSA started in 1994, the fall of '94. My wife, my now wife, was in that freshman class. I was a student at the University of Idaho, kind of next door. So I found out about NSA through some friends and whatnot. But anyhow, I think so I wasn't there at the very beginning, the initial formation, but I think I know the story enough. A lot of it comes from, if you're familiar with the classical Christian education movement, you've got classical Christian schools that are aimed at that K-12 range. Well, the whole classical school movement, really kind of ground zero for that was Logos School here in Moscow, Idaho. So Logos School was started in 1980, and my wife was a kindergartner in that first class. Well, when the idea was basically when those kids were graduating, what next? What do you do next? And NSA came in, was born to basically fill that need. So my wife finishes at Logos, and NSA was there for that next step. So on one level, it was started basically as the next step in the classical Christian education movement. A few of the distinctives about NSA, one thing is that we give one single undergraduate degree in liberal arts and culture. So it's a generalist liberal arts degree, not a vocationally specific certification, which is what most college education has become. Mm-hmm. And the idea is that we're not trying to give you a certificate to perform certain skills so you can get a certain job. We're aimed more at the core of the person using the ancient liberal arts tradition to refine those core human skills, which I think is a far more worthy focus for a college to aim itself. Other things about us, we're one of the few schools that do not take federal money, no Pell Grants, no student loans, so that we don't have government strings on our mission and our vision. Right. And I would say we're pretty theologically robust in our, it's a distinctively reformed education, and we are very robust in our application of the reformed worldview to all of life. And so I think we're known for being fairly bold and declaring what we believe Scripture says about what's going on in culture.
Yeah, very good. And I think I've heard, so like, for example, my kids are involved in classical conversations, which is a kind of classical education. I think I've heard them, I don't know if they sponsor with NSA or if they're connected at all. But could you just give us, for those who are not familiar with kind of that classical education, because we've seen the benefit with our kids and how, like you said, robust an education it can provide. But I know for a lot of people, maybe they're thinking toward the model that they graduated with in state school, and they're thinking, I want them to have a business degree or something like that. And that one degree can kind of maybe be confusing. Why is that a better option? Like, what would be your pitch for that?
Yeah. So I think this it's kind of a big thorny subject, but I think it's important to kind of get an understanding of. We have over the last 40 to 50 years really been retrained to think that education is primarily about vocational certification. You get an education in order to get a certain job, and that's definitely the case of how we think about college, but it's increasingly how we think about the K-12 education as well. And what happens is, long story short, we basically started to think of, man as a worker. He's a cog in a machine, and the machine is the economy, and the boss over the economy is the federal government. The government decides what industry is supposed to be like, how the economy is supposed to function. And if you want to be allowed into the machine, you need to get the proper certificates. And here are the institutions where you go to get those proper certificates so you can be a little cog in that machine. Right. I think it increasingly teaches a subservience to a really foreign, a really wicked worldview and a whole host of other things like that. But it also just isn't true. And I mean, I think that's the fundamental problem with it, is it just isn't true. And I think that colleges have given themselves to this idea that, okay, our degrees are certificates to get certain jobs. They've twisted the college education into something it was never intended to be, and something that is pretty obvious that it just doesn't actually work. So we have, America is told that if you want a job, you have to get a college degree that certifies you to perform that skill. But the thing is, even if you go and you get that degree, the first day you show up to the job, the first thing you find out is what they taught me in college doesn't really matter here. It's right. Irrelevant. It was taught by guys who have been separated from this industry for 15 years and probably left the industry because they were no good at it. And we realized really quickly that on-the-job training is really usually the best training for most career paths. You don't know what you're doing until you show up and actually learn how to do it. I did my undergraduate, I did chemistry, but I did it as an education degree. So I had to take all these education classes. And I show up to go student teaching, and it was like nothing I learned in an education class helped whatsoever. It was student teaching. It was get in the classroom and learn how to actually teach. That's where you learn it. So I think it's just a con to think that colleges are giving you the necessary information you need to perform that job. But then on top of that, increasingly the workforce, the way it works, once you get a job, you get that job for a couple of years, and then very quickly you decide, actually, I want to try this over here, and then I want to try this over here. And we move laterally so quickly now in a way that, 50 years ago, you didn't used to do that. But now we really move laterally. And as technology develops and new fields open up, you move into these new fields and old fields become irrelevant. And so your ability to move laterally is far more important. And nobody thinks that they have to go back in college to get a new degree every time they move laterally. It would be just silly. And so what we're saying is basically we want to focus on the core of the human, learn how to think critically, learn how to communicate, learn how to read, learn how to understand, learn how to argue, learn how to write, persuade others. Those things, first of all, they're a lot harder to inculcate. And I think that's why colleges shy away from focusing on those things. They just want to do these supposed vocational skills. They're a lot harder to inculcate, but they also serve you over the long term a lot better through the rest of life. So that's what we're kind of focused on. But I do think that, again, and there's some eschatology, I think, that's worked into this. The liberal arts degree, it comes from that word, liberal comes from the Latin liber, which is the Latin word for a free man. And the liberal arts were the skills that a free man is supposed to be inculcating in order to lead and shape others. Whereas the servile skills are the when you just learn how to do certain processes and whatnot. It's the servant's education. We have in America traded out the free man's education for a servant's education, and that's what most of our colleges are. And instead of teaching people how to lead, we teach them how to follow and how to do what they're told. And I think that's really when the church allows that to happen to it, where we no longer are understanding that our job is to lead this culture, but now we're in this sort of servile position of just doing what we're told. Right. I think a lot of that comes back to the education that we've been giving.
And I think that's why so much of what you're saying, so like the classical model and kind of this, like you were talking about, shaping kind of the holistic person and growing leaders. I think that's why it makes a lot of sense for Christians, is because education in many realms, it's like what like as if we're like a little repository or bucket of knowledge and things and facts, and then somehow that's going to produce something. Whereas what I hear a lot from you and from the classical movement is kind of personal formation. You're forming leaders, and I think it makes a lot of sense for the Christian, because I mean, anybody with a smartphone, the smartphone has more information than I can ever retain, right? Like I can look at that, but that doesn't lead to wisdom. That doesn't lead to actual true knowledge and growth. So I'm hearing like more of like a personal formation thing coming from what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because the more advanced we make in AI and all these sorts of things like that, the more it reveals how the more it strengthens the idea of a liberal arts education, because so many of these skills are replaceable by machines. Eventually, how many of these jobs can the robots do? But what the robot and the machine can never do is be a human. Mm-hmm. And that's why I think the humanities and knowing how to be a really good human is always going to put you on top. And it's funny because I can appreciate, I have to do like the sales pitch for NSA all the time, recruiting and fundraising and whatnot. And I know when somebody is sitting there listening, it sounds like you're saying, listen, it just sounds, it sounds like basically you're trying to make people feel better about the fact that they couldn't hack it in an engineering program, like right. You're minimizing jobs because you can't actually get one, and there's somehow you're trying to make people feel better about that, and I understand that kind of suspicion, but all I can say is when I see what the NSA graduates do, they're not hurting for work. Like the number of people coming to me and saying, I mean, I could just take you through my email this morning, the number of emails I get. Do you have an NSA graduate for this or for this? The value that people see in this kind of education is really striking. I have more people trying to get NSA grads than I have students, because when you have this kind of mind and training and intellect, you just can go a lot further with it.
Okay, yeah. So how does eschatology, because we've got to gear the conversation that way, Dr. Merkle, but how does eschatology play in there? Because a lot of the things that come out of NSA are eschatologically flavored, right? There's an optimistic eschatology at play there. How has that kind of helped shape not only the program, but also the way you guys educate the sort of formation that you guys are instituting in people? What does eschatology play?
I think I was at one of the Fight Laugh Feast conferences a while ago, and I gave a talk, and it was one of those things like it all comes together as you're doing it. But in the talk, I said basically, speaking to a lot of the Christians, you might not be post-mill, but the left is, and that's why they're winning, because they have an eschatology. They believe that they're building something. And the thing that is really striking, that kind of came to me as I was giving that talk, is the way it's why I believe institutions tend to be liberal. Liberals go for the institutions because institutions are the mechanisms for governing a whole society. When you put people together, the institutions are what you form in order to govern a whole society and take a society in a particular direction. Right. The left believes that the world is going a certain way, and so they take over the institutions to take the world in that direction. I think, excuse me, it's striking to me how conservative Christians are scared of institutions and they won't build them. And if they do build them, they almost always lose control, because as soon as an institution gets to any level of success, the left comes in and takes it over. Mm-hmm. If you start a successful school, once it gets to a certain size, the left comes and takes it over. You start a successful church that grows to a certain size, the left comes and takes it over. There's a liberalizing instinct in anything that starts to become an institution of any kind of power or whatever. And I think that that's made us scared of institutions when it should make us see, no, we need to be building, we need to be in control of these things, because we have an eschatology that tells us this is ours. We ought to control this. Your city government, your state government, your school boards, your library boards, all of these things Christians ought to be taking over, but we're scared of institutional leadership. And that's the thing that's really struck me is in growing NSA, and we've been, for the last few years, we've really turned this corner and starting to see institutional growth. And I'm starting to see what it takes to actually like lead an institution, but maintain faithfulness, like evangelical faithfulness in it. And the kinds of pressures that come against you are really significant. But I think that this is a space that Christians in general need to be taking over. We need to not be individuals back in the woods. We need to be the people in the town taking over the town and actually running the institutions, the banks, the businesses, everything like that.
Well, I think it's what you said about the eschatology of the left. I think that's just, for a lot of Christians, I feel like we struggle with, we look back to, whether it's back to our own middle school or high school experience, or we look back to our college experience or graduate school experience, and we kind of want that for our kids. And I would still consider myself a little bit young, 40s knocking on the door this summer for me, but kind of still feeling a little bit young. But then looking back at college and remembering the challenges of going to a state school, a state college, not that long ago, but how radically, well, number one, the challenges that were there that were counter faith, like explicitly counter Christian faith then, and then how much more those have grown now. I feel like for a lot of Christians, that's hard to grapple with. And it's almost, I don't know that it's a sense of denial, but it's just a sense of like being real about the challenges that exist for our children in education.
Oh, yeah, I think that's really true. That's one of the things that I run up against a lot of times talking to parents who are considering NSA, but they will say, listen, you tell me that the state schools have these problems, but I remember going to the University of Idaho, and I can remember the time when the professor was hostile to the Christian faith, and I had to stand up, and it required a certain courage of me, and that was actually a good thing for me. It was a helpful thing for me. And so they're remembering these things, and they're saying, I want my kid to face that kind of challenge. I think that it would sharpen him and whatnot. And the thing that I keep wanting to help them see which is what you just expressed, is that what you experienced is not what's going on there now. It's a completely different experience. And if you think you're sending them to the experience that you had, it's kind of like, I went to a public school, I'm a public school graduate, and I can remember the hostility and the sin and all the stuff that was going on in the school, but you could make it as a Christian. You could, and it could actually sharpen your witness. And so people say, I remember what that was like. I think my kids can handle it. Maybe they could handle what you went through, but what's going on in the public school system now is completely different. And you're really closing your mind and closing your eyes if you think it's the same. But I think there's something really significant that has happened there, which is, again, why we need to build our Christian institutions. We need to be starting these schools, starting these colleges to actually give our kids the foundation they need.
Yeah. So I want to run the NSA ad that came out just recently. I'm going to go ahead and run this, and then I'd like to talk with you just a little bit about it.
Sure.
Do you smell that? I hope you're not used to it. I'm talking about that vicious, eye-burning, skin-peeling smell that surrounds all of us. The smell of proxy wars with overtones of the parties in Hunter Biden's photos. Feminism, trans madness, faux pandemic, real panic. Climate tyranny, social media slavery, Epstein's suicide, fair elections with hints of brimstone charred oak, and the Pelosi's stock profits, all stewing in a Houston Planned Parenthood's dumpster in August. That is the smell of the thing we once called America, dead and composting. The postmortem on America isn't complicated. First founded by starving pilgrims and slaves, refugees and immigrants crying out to God for deliverance, this nation was pitched like a tent by men and women struggling in the mud and the dust, who survived drought and depression, and twice left home to bleed and die and save the world. Yes, there was hypocrisy, pietism, self-righteousness, injustice. But this land became strong despite it all by God's grace and by the sacrifice of farm boys crawling up foreign beaches in the sweat of their fathers, tilling soil and feeding beef. American boys tamed the sky and walked in space. We touched the world with our Navy, our love of sports and stories, underdogs, and barbecue. And now, we touch it all with our rot. The greatest nation in history has been laid low by one simple evil: lies. The deadliest was the first, the lie that our greatness was our own doing, and so many more came after. The lies of secularism, moral neutrality, and self-fulfillment, of feminism and Marxism, the lies of the sexual revolution and evolution, pointless wars and taxation, inflation and a manipulated currency, the lies that lashed out at God, tearing away at our belief in beauty, goodness, and truth, the lies that sought to place our own lusts and the lusts of our masters on God's throne, lies to control, to placate, and to destroy. The storm of lies has reached hurricane force now. Whole states are being evacuated. The deception swirls so fast and furious that the liars don't even bother to hide it. Question: where do lies get their power? Answer: from the idiocy of the deceived. How many lies can a people believe before it's their own fault? 1, 2, 44,000? Lies lose all their power when the deceived become wise, when their minds are no longer easy to bridle and control, when they learn to think and can seek the truth through any fog, and when they learn to laugh at those lies. The winds will reverse, the fog will clear. Do not despair. These are the times we were given. We are the people God made for this moment. The faithful and the undeceived will rebuild in the ruins, and we will do it singing, feasting, loving, and laughing. We will plant again, and we will harvest 30, 60, and 100-fold. After all, composting empires make the richest soil. New St. Andrew's College. Liberal arts for lovers of truth. Laughing at lies since 1994.
Okay, so I wanted to run that video because I was telling my wife, I don't think I've ever watched an ad as many times as I've rewatched that advertisement for NSA. But there's so many big themes that were hit on in there. The composting empires make the richest soil, and it's not even No Quarter November. But what motivated this video for you guys? Like, what was the impetus behind this video? Because you're addressing, I think, some things that are really resonating with a lot of people that would watch that video. Is one reason it's been so widespread.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the thing that we're experiencing is this moment of what feels like kind of a national hopelessness for Christians, as you see all kinds of crazy, just things falling apart. And what we want to do is say, listen, this should inspire you. Like this should make you feel like, so there's so much opportunity in front of us now. Right. Of all the times that you could be alive, what an awesome moment to be alive right now and to be able to build the kinds of things that we're looking to build right now. I really want to strike a note of cultural optimism at a moment like that, and Christians should be out in the front saying, let's get up, let's go, because there's so much opportunity in front of us right now.
Yeah, and that's what strikes such a chord with that video. You know, such a short video, but it was very well done. There's this tangible story that you're a part of. But I think we're used to the first part, right? Like the first half of that video, and you're looking at the rot that is being produced by our culture, and you're like, yes. But I think the typical conclusion from that for many Christians is just like, well, either wash our hands of the whole thing and wait it out, or just abandon it completely. Whereas the second part of the video, that's that optimism, is like, now's the time to build.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I love the idea of pitching NSA in the context of eschatology, because it really the postmillennialism is so critical to what it is that we're doing. I do believe that premill eschatology, this idea that we're just waiting to be raptured out of here, that escapist kind of thing, I think that is really just handicap the church in building the things that we ought to build, and not seeing the opportunity that is in front of us right now. So
how would you recommend? I mean, so you're a Christian parent. You're your Christian grandparent, whatever you happen to be, but you're church people, and you're looking at this, and maybe you're not going to be going to college. NSA is not on the docket for you. But how are Christians to be looking to build institutions? Because when you say something like build institutions, that could be pretty intimidating for a lot of people. So they see this, they see a lot of intimidation, they see a lot of darkness in the culture around. We're trying to pitch a hopeful, optimistic eschatology, even in the midst of, if God's doing something of judgment or darkness here in our context, there's going to be growth that he's going to bring through that. But how would you recommend Christians start thinking toward practically plugging in with that sort of mindset?
Yeah, I think one of the big things is understanding that, what you're going to hand off, you're going to hand off to other people. And I think everybody has this pessimism that the next generation will only make it worse. And so there's nothing that I'm going to build that could be handed off successfully. But institution building is really just discipleship. It's having confidence in discipleship. It's this idea that I have a team that I'm working with, and someday all of this work that I've done to physically build the buildings that I've built, we're actually building buildings, we're doing construction, we're launching programs, curriculum, hiring faculty. Someday I'm going to walk out of here and leave the keys with them. And my impact on them, the discipleship that I've done of passing on this vision, determines whether this institution survives. And I believe that we actually ought to have confidence in discipleship, that God will bless our discipleship. We should pray about it. We should be thinking about it as we're training up that next generation and helping them to understand why these things are significant. It's really just optimistic discipleship when I say institution building.
Right.
But it's also the confidence that God has intended for us to actually advance, for these things to grow and have a real fruitful impact over generations.
Yeah, the generational thing I think is so key with eschatology. Every time we talk about hopeful eschatology or an optimistic eschatology, I think that's what's in my mind first, is the third and fourth generation down the road. I'm thinking of my great grandkids. If God should be so kind to give me those, but I don't think it's the way a lot of Christians approach that type of thinking. We're thinking, it's probably going to unwind in the next 10 years, and that's going to be it, which I think just inevitably is going to impact the way we are building and investing in the world.
Well, I think one thing that can help with that is, this is where a good education can really come in handy, where if you look at the history of the West, this idea that a church must necessarily liberalize, that everything must fail. Well, there is a sense in which, everything ultimately, every man dies, every man goes, gets turned to compost and whatnot. But the story of the Christian church has been one of constant advance. And we've had centuries and centuries of faithful churches growing and having this enormous impact. And then maybe that particular church at some point kind of fades into obscurity, but the work that they did is passed on. And when you can start to see yourself as a piece of that, I become extremely optimistic for the work that we're doing and the implications that this work will have over generations. I mean, I fully intend for New St. Andrews to have the legacy that a place like Oxford, has had in England. I intend for NSA to have that. That's what I'm working towards. And we won't know the verdict on that until maybe 2 or 3 centuries from now, if that. So I won't be around for it, but that's what I'm working for.
Right. Tell me this, Dr. Merkle, because obviously you guys are involved in a classical formation there at NSA, but I'm wondering, what's your take, and this might be a really broad question, but what's your take on just kind of theological or Christian higher education as it currently stands? I know I've spent in an inordinate amount of time in seminary education through my life, right? But when you look at seminaries, especially, there's different dynamics when it comes to accreditation and like you mentioned at the very front end, state funding and stuff like that. And not to trash any certain institution, but just what's your take on higher Christian education? Because specifically, I'm thinking in the context of churches, that's typically where the pastors are being educated. That's typically where a lot of that theological formation is happening. What's your lay of the land on Christian education, specifically higher education?
Yeah, we're definitely in a moment of significant sort of shaking, and I think you're seeing a lot of things go like this in real clear ways. I think federal money is I agree. There are plenty of schools that are great schools, great people that are taking federal money. So I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush here,
Sure.
but I believe they're going to be facing some really hard challenges in the near future as they make some hard decisions. And I do think that money is constantly compromising their witness and their willingness to speak into the microphone on certain issues. And
Right.
I wish we would see more Christian schools just step off of it. So that's a real issue. I say, one of my real frustrations that I constantly bump into is I kind of see basically even the Christian schools that we network with. I divide them in kind of two categories. There are the schools that take academic rigor really seriously and really push themselves hard with regard to academic rigor, but who also tend to really minimize faith commitment. And these are the places that are going LGBT, whatever.
Right.
And it's sad because they're the places that have had more attention towards academic rigor, but they have lost all of their evangelical witness, compromise, whatnot. On the other hand, I have schools that I would say, these are the schools I know are going to stand with me on LGBT issues, all these different things. They'll be, creationists. They'll be, unashamed creation, whatever. And yet I frequently find the academic rigor to be really, really low. And at NSA, what we're trying to blend is a really high level academic rigor. This is intense. And yet we're going to be completely clear and strong on our Christian witness. And it's really hard to find people who meet you right there.
Right.
So it's a tense thing. I mean, and of those two, it's funny because I love the academic rigor, but if push comes to shove, I prefer being with these people any day of the week. They're unashamed of scripture. I'm going to be with them.
Right.
And I would love to help them raise their tone, but that's a far more fruitful base to build on.
Right.
And so we find ourselves constantly torn between those two, and those are the kinds of pressures we see.
Right. I wonder what sort of trends that you see right now that would encourage you with Christian education. I'm thinking maybe things that people could keep an eye on. I know you guys have brought on, like Jared Longshore's come over to NSA recently, and he's a lecturer there. Joe Rigney just recently, very, very popularly came over to NSA. But I'm just wondering, like, what trends maybe for those who are kind of looking at the lay of the land, they're not familiar with maybe the inner workings of some of these seminaries. What things do you see that would encourage you that you'd say that's somewhere that I would invest possibly? That's something that I could partner with.
Yeah. Well, I would say the thing that I'm most encouraged by right now has been just the success of the classical K-12 movement.
Okay.
I think honestly, classical Christian education is the American evangelical church's biggest win over this last generation.
Wow.
What's the one place where we've scored points? It has been building these schools. It is a huge movement. It has a tremendous impact, and it's just in time. And these kids that are coming out of that pipeline are so much more prepared than kids in the public school world. I'm just really excited about that classical Christian K-12 movement, and it's a huge testimony to God's kindness to us. At the college level right now, I don't think I see what I see are a lot of people clamoring for, I think we need to maybe do something different. And I think that the success from that K-12 movement is starting to push its way into college. Okay. I think the thing that really concerns me is, and this always happens with God's people, where, people are faithful. Faithfulness gives you prosperity and success, and then your prosperity and success becomes the occasion for your temptation to your downfall.
Right.
And that's the cycle we always go through. And my concern is that all of our success with the K-12 classical movement, what I see right now is I see the vultures swooping in around that movement and wanting to take it over. I mean, I said earlier, liberals, when they see an institution rise to a certain level of success, they come in and they take it over. Right. And that is the fight that's going on right now. Who will classical Christian education stay Christian, faithful, evangelical, or does it become co-opted and turned into a knockoff prep school? Like, we wear plaid and we speak Latin and we go on to all the exact same colleges that everybody else went to, and we lose our faith. We do all the same. That pressure is on really hard right now. And so do we hang on to this? And then do we build the next level, the colleges that can be that faithful next level? Do we build that? That's a big question. The other thing I would say is what we're seeing is building a college takes 100 times the work that it takes to build a K-12 school. And you're seeing this in a number of, we've been in this space since the 90s, these new colleges that were forming in this space that, a lot of these classical kids were going to. What you're seeing now is some of those colleges are doing really well, and a bunch of them are starting to crumble and fall apart. And It turns out it's just not easy to do this. And I think that a lot of people don't understand what it really takes to pull off a college like this. And so I hope that we can level up and build that next generation of leadership that can build these colleges.
Right. Yeah, that's, as you were talking, I was thinking of C.S. Lewis's That Hideous Strength, and there's that point at which Mark is going through his whole confrontation. He's talking about when the crooked meets the straight. I feel like for a lot of Christian parents, that's kind of where they're being confronted with things that the way things were, or the way things we would hope they would be, there is an inevitable divide. So we have to be doing something different. We have to be looking toward these things, I feel. With the classical Christian education, I think that's a good way to go. If people are not familiar with what you're talking about, kind of a reading list, or just maybe even one or two that you might be able to direct them toward, maybe a website, like where could they go to maybe start to understand this whole dynamic you're speaking about? What would be a good introduction for
I mean, just a few resources off the top of my head. I mean, the book that started it all was Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning. That was a book that Doug Wilson wrote, I think, in 1990. And it was riffing off of Dorothy Sayers' essay, The Lost Tools of Learning, which had inspired his experiment with Logos School. So Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning, and then there's some subsequent books that Doug has written since then. But that first one really kind of is what launched the movement. Other resources, if you go to the Association of Classical Christian Schools, ACCS, they are a fantastic resource for people who are looking to start classical schools. I would go to their webpage and just go through everything on that. Classical Conversations is that you've already mentioned using that. It's a homeschooling kind of spinoff. Lee Borton's read Doug's book, Recovering Lost Tools of Learning. She read it and then took what he had done and applied it to the homeschooling world. And Classical Conversations becomes this network that's fantastic for, when we were living in England, we for 3 years had to homeschool our kids, and we were terrible homeschooling parents, had no clue what we were doing. If you're in that situation, Classical Conversations becomes this kind of resource to put everything together all around you in a really helpful way. And then you also have like Logos Online, Kepler Academy. These are like online schools that will help you. Like once you hit that high school level and you feel like I can't teach my kids physics, you go to Logos Online and they can take care of these classes for you. Basically, I think there's a lot of the resources there now to give your kids a classical Christian education. They weren't there, 20 years ago, but now it's so robust and so good. And I can say as a college president who's seeing the kids come out of the system, I mean, these are the kids we want to admit. These are the kids that I could tell you, looking at other colleges, I've seen a number of other colleges reinvent themselves entirely in order to recruit kids coming out of the classical Christian education movement, because they see the value of what's coming out of there, and that's the pipeline they want to draw from. Wow.
Okay. No, that's good, and I appreciate that. I want to be respectful of your time, but where can people follow you, Dr. Merkle? Where are you active, and where can people keep up with what you're doing?
Yeah, I think one of the best places to go is to the NSA webpage, nsa.edu. And if you go to the blog, You can see I'm posting on education all the time there. You can subscribe to our newsletter and get regular updates from us as I'm walking through. I do like every 2 weeks, I'll do another article on what's going on in higher education and kind of our unique view on it. You can also follow me on Twitter.
Perfect. What's your handle on Twitter?
It's a good question. It probably has something like President NSA or something like that. You have exposed a place where I know nothing of what I'm doing.
We will put that on the show notes. No worries, sir. We'll get you on there. No, I appreciate it.
I have people to do I do my little stuff with my computer and other people make it go out. I'm not good at that part.
Good. No, I appreciate you chatting with us today, though. Thank you so much. And appreciate your time, sir.
Okay, thank you.